Andiamo zitti la mano, perché lo stiamo facendo una balla, ma si vede che molla, mi sembra molla, per sapere la si vuole la mattina, quando facciamo la mattina, cosa ci può la mattina.
Welcome to Communicology. I'm Richard Talbert. I'm an associate professor of communication and media. I love studying human communication. I also love studying how media and culture intersect. So let's talk today about what is communicology. So communicology, if you look at the actual literal translation and break it down into the communo and the ology, you can look at communa meaning to discuss, to share, to impart. It's also part of fellowship, to make common. So when you see community or communion inside a church service, you're looking at people gathering together, sharing, discussing, imparting any kind of knowledge to each other. Then ology, typically we look at that as the study of. It's a branch of learning, a study of a particular subject. So what we're looking at is a branch of learning about communication itself and how we can understand it further. That's the literal translation, but there are people who have more in-depth conversational breakdowns of the definition. Let's take a look at some of those. According to the Institute of Communicology, that's an actual thing, the idea of communicology is a meta-discipline, a field of studies that compares, classifies knowledge from other disciplines. So when you talk about something being a meta study, it's something that stands above and beyond and then looks over and analyzes how those things interact. So if you stand above and beyond, say, the earth and look and see how different natural things interact with each other, how weather affects plants and how plants affect animals, that's a meta-analysis of ecology. So when you look at communication and stand back and above and look at communication, well, how does it work and how does it come to play with each other? And so that's one thing we'll look at there. They also say it's a study of the structure and dynamics of communication and change when all experience and behavior is defined, described, and understood as communication. This has an obvious framing, an obvious worldview, an obvious lens through which they are looking at how communication works and how humans interact. Basically, they're saying all experience and behavior is defined, described, and understood as communication. There's a famous saying in our field that you cannot not communicate. You always are communicating. But what about if I'm not talking? Well, you're still communicating. We give off nonverbal cues. In fact, our nonverbal communication, something we'll look about in a different podcast, our nonverbal cues are somewhere around the area of 80 to 90% of our communication. The verbal communication, the actual words that are coming out of our mouths, just 10 to 20%, that's it. So it's a real surprise to think of it that way, but really, when you look at people, most of the time when you're making judgments, when you're thinking about them, you're thinking along the ideas of, they made a face. Look at their body language, those kind of things. So we're looking at those kind of things that they're doing, even gestures that I'm doing with my hands. That's a way of communication. So when you look at the idea of we're always communicating, you cannot not communicate, that makes sense because even if you're sleeping, how do we know you're sleeping? Well, you're laying there, you're breathing, good thing. Your eyes are closed, maybe you're snoring, maybe you're drooling, but the idea is we can tell just by looking at it, you're still alive, but you're in a moment of rest. Just the same thing if you're dead. How can you tell someone's dead? Well, they're not breathing. There's no heartbeat. Their body is still communicating even in death. So we can not stop communicating. We just continually do it. So the idea that when we look at the structure and dynamics of communication and change, which is another key part of this definition, again, communication is very structured. We have to understand. We have our common systems of symbols, signs, and behavior that we count upon. Because if we didn't, we have a hard time understanding. Like when you travel to a different culture, when you travel abroad or to some area you've never been before, or try to consume something you don't know, like you're trying to catch up on some sport that you don't know what it's like, or some movie series and you're catching on the tail end of it. You need somebody to lay out the structure so you can understand the now. And that's the same thing with communication. There is absolute structure that has to happen there. So when somebody says something, we understand what that means. If someone uses a different word, we stop because we're not quite sure what that means. And we get confused by it. So then you also look at the dynamics too. It's not this static, boring thing that just sits there. It is active. It is constant. It's constantly in motion and changing. You look at the idea of who we are, we don't sit still. We're constantly evolving, constantly changing. If anything, I'm, a few seconds older than that last statement. I'm changing. And we all change, and we continually change. And our communication changes inside that as well. Then, of course, it says the structure and dynamics of communication and change. Why do we communicate? Now, this is where we start moving into the philosophy of persuasion. But we typically try to introduce or incite some kind of change. I want things. How do I get things? I try to use my words. I try to use my actions. I'm communicating that there's something that I want and I want to get it. I'm trying to affect some kind of change. I'm trying to convince you to go with me to lunch to where I want to eat, not where you want to eat. Or, quite frankly, we look at some other kind of means. Like if I want a pay raise, I don't sit back and wait for it to happen. I do something. I communicate in some way to say that I would like to have this pay raise. Same thing with any other kind of thing when you're trying to affect and change things, whether it's some kind of behavior, some kind of outcome, whatever. I need to expect that communication is one of those things that brings about change. Also, another definition they have here is the study of common key factors in change work. I love this phrase, in change work. 2 words, change work. So I want to work for change. So what are common key factors to make change happen? Well, you can try to persuade somebody. You can also coerce somebody. Persuasion, typically we think of how do I use my words, my actions. Coercion, of course, is the threat of violence. I mean, that gets change. Is it ethical? No. But it's one of those things that we still tend to do, and we tend to push it that way. So we look at these common key factors and what happens. What are good ways, good practices to get change to happen? Well, the only way is to really study it to understand it. Okay, the last time I asked for this, I used these words and it didn't happen. Maybe I need to use these other words and to see if it'll happen this time. Or maybe last time I talked to this person and it didn't work. So I'll talk to this person. Kind of like when you're young. You ask mom for something, mom says no, go to dad, maybe you'll get a different result. Again, you're looking at common key factors that make change work possible. Now, not to be confused with the Institute of Communicology, there's also the International Communicology Institute. Same idea, but different organization. They define communicology as the science of human communication. So, again, when you think of communication talking, you don't think, well, how's that a science? Well, again, in our minds, we tend to think science is something like petri dishes and microscopes and things like that we're doing in a lab. Again, we're science is a study of, so we can study human communication. One of the human science disciplines, it uses the logic-based research methods of semiotics and phenomenology to explicate human consciousness and behavioral embodiment as discourse, withholding global culture. So you think of the idea of some big $20 words in here with inflation 30. Logic-based research. So in other words, it's not feelings. It's more rational that we think through and try to understand what does this mean? How does this entail? And then how can I then research that and understand it? So I'm observing. Maybe I'm actually getting involved and noticing when I'm inside and I'm trying to understand how behavior is happening. You think of ethnography when people move into like a people group and study them from the inside and try to understand why do people do what they do. That's the basic kind of concept here. So looking of semiotics and phenomenology, semiotics, of course, we're looking at language structure, language usage. Again, a key part of communication. And phenomenology is, again, a very fancy word. It's basically the study of phenomena, the study of experience. So you think of things that a person goes through and how that informs how they act, how they think, how they behave, and how they react to the next thing that comes along. So we're looking at word structure, we're looking at experience added together to understand this idea of how does this all work within global culture. And communicology, they also say, is the study of human discourse in all of its semiotic and phenomenological manifestations of embodied conscious and practice in the world of other people and their environment. So in other words, it's not all about you. The world is made of other people. How do they communicate? And that's one of the key things that keeps communication scholars employed, is that we're terrible at understanding communication because everyone's different. I think a certain way, you think a certain way. I talk a certain way, you talk a certain way. I listen a certain way, you listen a certain way, and they don't always jive up. So as a result, we end up having a way that, we have this disagreement, we have confusion. Sometimes if everything works out great, we agree and everything's fantastic. But that's, as we know, not the norm. I mean, we're always searching, trying to understand more things and trying to understand more about each other. Then you throw in different cultural ramifications, the way that people live their lives, and that radically shifts everything. So you throw in that, and then of course you focus on the environment. Again, how I behave in like one area is one way, then how I behave in another is another area. Like in the business world, I have a certain way that I behave. When I'm in church, I have a certain way that I behave. And when I'm hanging out with friends, there's a certain way I behave. And, I dress a certain way at each different place. I talk and use different language at each place. That doesn't mean I'm being fake. It just means that it would be weird to hang out with my friends and be just going on and on about semiotics and phenomenology instead of talking about things like hunting and cycling, all kinds of fun stuff on that side. Whereas in church, I should be geared up to talking about things about scripture and theology. Again, that's that cultural area, that cultural environment, and where that kind of communication belongs. So communication, they also say, is the critical study of discourse and practice. Not just discourse, two people communicating, but practice, especially the expressive body as mediated by the perception of cultural signs and codes. This gets fun because we start moving into the idea of the expressive body, which, how do you do your hair? Do you wear glasses? What kind of glasses do you have? What kind of clothes do you wear? How do you sit? We express all the time with our bodies, as I mentioned before. So that's an important part to think about, but it's also is mediated by the perception of cultural signs and codes. So mediation is a huge thing. So right now I'm coming to you through a camera into YouTube, through your phone, your laptop, however you're consuming this. Maybe you're only listening to this and not even watching. That's one of those things that it's a mediated form of communication. Immediated, which means no mediation, it's just you and I face to face. So when someone talks about something being immediate, we tend to think now, but immediate really means without a medium in between us. So it's just direct. As soon as something is translated through something else, now it's mediated. Whether it's a note, whether it's a letter, whether it's a text, doesn't matter. As long as I'm sending it somewhere else through something else, it's now mediated. And there are rules. There are cultural signs, there's cultural codes, rules that happen within that mediation. And that's something we typically don't think too deeply of until it blows up. And then we're like, oh, that's right, I shouldn't have said that over a text. But that's what we do. So we need to think of those kind of things. And it mentions here, this also includes art communicology, clinical communicology, media communicology, and the philosophy of communicology. So we're looking at major branches within communicology that come into play too. Art. What does art look like? What's art? I'm defining art. And again, that's one of those things that people wrestle with, and they should wrestle with it, because if it was simple, it probably wouldn't be art. But we like to have the idea that we could wrestle with things and it'd be kind of fun and interesting. The idea that, that is art to me. That's just noise, and I'm not really interested. So whenever we look at those kind of things and we see and we try to define art, some people bristle because, oh, you're putting it in a box. But sometimes there are objective things that we could say that is art versus that is trash, or that is noise, or that is something else altogether. So studying that, again, communicology, so looking at some meta view of trying to understand art through communication. And then clinical communicology, again, how is something used and put in practice? Again, we think clinical, we think like some kind of a medical thing. Again, it's practice. So how is it put in practice? So job site at a building being constructed, or job site at a building where it's inside the office in cubicles. There's all kinds of different ways that we can look at how people communicate, how things are mediated, how things move. Media communicology, which I already discussed a bit, and again, it changes. You can send certain messages through a text, certain messages through a letter. Certain letters should be handwritten and some should be typed. Again, every kind of message is different, and it then carries certain communicative attributes. So again, depending on the message I use, or the medium I use, it will deliver a message in a certain way. This goes back to McLuhan's concept in understanding media, that the medium is the message. So if I choose a certain medium, that's already delivering a message, whether I like it or not. So if I send something through Instagram, people are thinking it's probably a photo. If I'm sending something through TikTok, they're thinking it's probably a short video. Again, that medium is already carrying a message before I even tried putting anything into it, just because when you embrace that medium, it's going to be a certain way. And then the philosophy of communicology, this is again, grand scope of understanding philosophy, philo and Sophia, the love of wisdom. So looking at the wisdom and the understanding and the breakdown of trying to understand why. Not just the how. There are things working the how, but the why. Why do we communicate? Why do we care about communication? Why do we wrestle with it so? Why do we have so many problems with it? Well, that's the part of the fun of studying it, because you'd think we'd get it right by now. I mean, how many thousands of years have we as humans been communicating, and we still get it wrong? Now, granted, we only live so long. We die, the next people come and they make their mistakes, and then they die, the next people come along, they die. And so it's not like we've got this progressive wisdom that stays. And sometimes we just love making our own mistakes. So instead of just saying, oh, that person told me not to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway to see if I can get a different result. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you don't, because the truth of the matter is, it's a different person doing the message. It's a different person receiving the message. So it might change. Oy, how do you keep track of all that stuff? And it's one of those things that it's challenging. But that's the part of the fun of studying communication. So I'll close with this. Scholar Willem Flusser views communicology as a philosophical approach to communication, as a phenomenon that permeates every aspect of human existence, organized around questions such as, what is communication? What are codes? And what is technical imagination? His work touches on theater, photography, film, television, and more. And it's one of those things that we, especially in our world that we have today, our hyper-mediated world that we have today, we're constantly thinking of communication in those codes and through those different media. But the truth of the matter is at the end of the day, it's a person trying to have some kind of discourse with another person. Am I trying to influence? Am I trying to entertain? Am I trying to just inform, pass on information? Just like when I teach a speech class, you're going to give a speech to either persuade or to inform. Those are your two main reasons of doing it. And then from there, you're going to break down, well, how am I going to do it? Am I going to use some humor? Am I going to use some story and parable? Am I going to use some other kind of way to deliver this message? We're constantly trying to figure out that. We tend to often, though, think too much about the small side of things, like what device will I use to send this message? Exactly what words will I put together in this sentence to come up with this message? Well, that makes sense because it's how we interact with those things. But the idea of the struggle that we have is that we're not thinking sometimes big picture. So that's the idea with communicology, stepping back, meta approach, looking and seeing from start to finish, how do I want this thing to move? From beginning to end, how do I want this thing to go? As you can guess, that's going to be a big problem. So what we need to do is to sometimes sit back and think. It's a different mindset because we're used to the microscopic now instead of starting way back, like when these conversations first started, to where do I want them to go in the future? You can see how that could be a problem. So that's the basic nutshell of communicology. So what we're going to do is, as we move forward and look more about communicology and all the issues of communication, we're going to break down some of these small things to help you understand how they fit into the bigger picture. So that's where we're going to end up for today, and I hope to catch you next time. So if you like what you heard today, please like, share, subscribe. And if also you didn't like, thanks for hanging around this long. So talk to you later and study more.